So as you see, this morning we're going to talk a little bit about walking on water and other such fluid surfaces. Any of you ever walk on water? Not successfully. All right, well, that's good. Really, none of you? I'd like to say I have. I really haven't. It's true. We're going to talk about walking on water and other fluid surfaces because I have no idea why. It just seemed like cool. Wouldn't you like to be able to walk on water? Wouldn't you like to be able to just go out and take a step and know that you're not going to fall? Wouldn't that be cool? But have you ever stopped and thought about, what are the difficulties of walking on water? I'm a little heavy. When I step on water, water doesn't hold me. But have you ever stopped and thought about, what it would actually be like to walk on water? Just for a second. Just take a step out and try to walk on a surface that is not only constantly moving, but is constantly uneven. What I was getting at before this microphone decided to hate me. When you stop and think about Jesus walking on water, when you stop and think about Jesus actually moving across the water, how many of you actually think about him being on top of the water? Really? Because in my mind, to make it more simple, I always think about Jesus having about that much water above his feet, because that way it's smooth and even and it works well, right? Because having the water constantly changing and moving, it seems much more simple to pretend like there's some glass underneath the water, and then he can just smoothly walk out and do his wave. Hi everybody. It's good to see you. I know, waves, good. But you think about Jesus walking on the water, and it's amazing, right? It's fantastic. If you haven't guessed, we're going to be in Matthew chapter 14. If you want to open up your Bibles, we're going to take a look at Matthew chapter 14. But I do want you to know that this is not the only place that tells this story. This is actually a story that takes place in 3 of the 4 Gospels. So if you want the Bible app notes, we use the Bible app. And the notes are there, and I put all 3 scriptures there so that you can compare and contrast and see how it works. But we're going to focus on Matthew's account of this. And it starts in Matthew 22, if you're flipping there, scrolling there. 22, Jesus walking on the water. Let me read this for you. It's kind of up on the screen. You can kind of see it. All right, Matthew chapter 14, verse 22, Matthew writes, "Immediately Jesus made the disciples go into the boat and go on ahead of him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowd. After he had dismissed them, he went up on a mountainside by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone, but the boat was already a considerable distance from land, buffeted by the waves because the wind was against it. During the 4th watch of the night, Jesus went out to them, walking on the water, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him, see, I told you, this one hates me too. We'll try it anyway. During the 4th watch of the night, Jesus went out to them, walking on the lake. When the disciples saw him walking on the lake, they were terrified. 'It's a ghost,' they said, and cried out in fear. But Jesus immediately said to them, 'Take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid.' 'Lord, if it is you,' Peter replied, 'tell me to come out to you on the water.' 'Come,' he said. Then Peter got down out of the boat, walked on the water, and came toward Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, cried out, 'Lord, save me!' Immediately Jesus reached out his hand and caught him. 'You of little faith,' he said, 'why do you doubt?' When they climbed into the boat, the wind died down. Then those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, 'Truly, you are the Son of God.'" Now, again, there's other versions of this. Mark and John don't include the part about Peter, and that's why I want to focus on Matthew's account of this story. But I do like some of the things that come out of Mark. If you read Mark's account of this story, the disciples are out in the boat fighting the wind and the waves, and Jesus has finished praying, and so he starts to walk out towards them. But instead of walking to the boat, Jesus is just kind of like power walking by. He's like, "Yeah, suckers, I'm going to beat you there." And they look over, and they're like, "Wait a minute, Jesus, hold on. We're dying over here." And Jesus has to be like, "Fine." And he gets in the boat, and the wind and waves stop. But this account This account to me is the great one because of Peter, and we're going to get to Peter here in a little bit, but I want to go over a few things that help you kind of understand and put into context what's going on here, because this is like the second half of a story. We're jumping into the middle of the story, and so to really truly appreciate what's happening and why Jesus is sending his disciples away immediately and all that kind of stuff, we need to know what happened before this. So if you go back to the beginning of chapter 14, people have come to tell Jesus, John the Baptist, your cousin, has been killed. And Jesus, being the guy that he is, I mean, I think any of you, if you came, or if somebody came to you and said that your friend and this guy who was doing great work and was preparing the way for you has been killed because of what he was saying, you might feel a little bad. You might be a little sad. And Jesus, wanting to mourn for his cousin and for his friend and for this man who had been helping prepare the way for him, Jesus decides that he wants to get away. He wants to be able to go spend time alone and pray. And so he begins to go to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. And of course, people want to be around Jesus. And so they follow him to the other side of the sea. And Jesus, being the kind, compassionate man he is, he lets them stay, and he heals, and he teaches, and he spends time with them. And as the day is growing on, the disciples come to Jesus and they say, hey, Jesus, it's a little late. There's no town around here. We should probably feed these people. And we're all pretty familiar with the story, right? The disciples say, Jesus, we need to feed these people. And Jesus says, well, why don't you do it? And they're all like, because we and we cannot do that. And so Jesus says, all right, well, does anybody have some food? And somebody's like, hey, this kid's got a Lunchable. Oh, it's a Happy Meal, you know. Hey, we found this kid with a Happy Meal. He's got some fishes and some bread. What do you think? And Jesus takes the food, and he prays over it, and they begin to hand it out, and over 5,000 people are fed off of this Happy Meal, right? It's amazing. It's wonderful. God is doing great things. The problem is that God is doing such great things that the crowd, if you take a look at John's gospel, as he's telling this story, in John chapter 6, in verses 14 and 15, it says, after the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world. Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. So the point is that Jesus immediately sends his disciples away because the whole crowd is getting this idea, hey, we should make this guy king. I mean, imagine about it. You've got free health care because Jesus can heal just about anything. You've got free food, no hunger, because he can take just anything and make an entire meal for 5,000 people. Even if you need, he can take some water and turn it into wine, and now we've got a party. So we should make Jesus king because he can meet any and every need. And whether he likes it or not, he's going to do it for us. And Jesus, knowing that his disciples either would get caught up in the same thing or thinking that, this might get dangerous and he wants to get them away, he says to his disciples, get in the boat and go. The disciples listen. They get in the boat and they begin to head out across the water. Now, we don't know exactly what time this was. We don't know exactly when Jesus had finished feeding people and told the disciples to go, but it's evening. 6, 7 o'clock at night. Jesus tells the crowds, you're not going to make me king, go home. And he gets to go up onto the mountain and finally do the thing that he had set out to do to begin with, to spend time with the Father, to mourn for his cousin, to talk to his dad and just work out what was going on in his life. He spends time alone. But the thing is that he spends quite a lot of time alone with God. It says that Jesus was going to go out to them about the fourth watch. And so the way that they divided, Jewish people divided the night up into 3 parts, but the Romans divided it up into 4 parts. And so Matthew is going with the 4-part night, meaning that there was a watch from 6 to 9, and then from 9 to midnight, and then from midnight to 3, and then from 3 to 6 a.m. And so in the 4th watch of the night, meaning sometime between 3 and 6 a.m., Jesus gets done talking to God, and decides to go out and meet his disciples. Now, I don't know if you know much about the Sea of Galilee, but at the widest point, it is 8 miles wide. At the northern part where the disciples were trying to cross, it's 5 miles wide. Meaning that these guys have been in a boat or a couple of boats for like 8 hours trying to cross 5 miles. Can you imagine the wind and the waves that are keeping you from going 5 miles? I don't know about you, but I would probably be pretty tired. I'm a little worn out just thinking about having to try to row a big boat for 5 miles, and it's taking me probably 8 hours to not get there, to maybe only be halfway across. And that's when Jesus shows up. That's when Jesus shows up, and as he's making his way across the water, they see him, and they are scared, and they're tired, and they're worn out, and it's a ghost. Well, duh, it's a ghost. Come on. Who else would be on the water? Because, they're somewhat superstitious. These guys are professionals. But they know that storms crop up on this lake very easily. And they're not exactly sure what lies at the bottom of the water because who can see it? And so they have fears about the water, but at the same time, these guys know these waters. Peter, Andrew, James, John, and probably several others of the disciples had been fishermen and had spent their lives learning when to go fishing, where to go fishing, how the current works, all these things. And so these are professional guys who have spent all night fighting against wind and waves and trying to get to where Jesus had told them to go. And as they're worn out, as they have seen amazing things, but now they're stuck in life, they're stuck in the middle of the water fighting against the wind, and Jesus comes along. And they think it's a ghost. Well, this morning, I want to tell you some things. Now, let me just say this. I don't want this to be like some kind of self-help kind of thing. I don't want this to be like, hey, follow these simple steps, and you too can walk on water. Because I have no idea how that will work. What I want to do today is I just want to tell you some observations that I had as I read this story. I want to tell you some things that I gleaned or that I felt like I began to understand as I looked at this story. And the first thing, the first point that I want you to understand is that in this situation, in life, in everything, you have to let God be God. Now, I know that sounds really simple, and you're like, what? Why did we have to come to church to hear that? We know that. But it may not be as simple as you think to let God be God. Here are these guys who have spent probably 1 or 2 years with Jesus, who have watched him heal people. They have watched him do amazing things. I know I mentioned them kind of jokingly, but to start off with turning water into wine and then work his way through and to heal people, to make the blind to see, to make the lame walk. He has made lepers clean. He has done all kinds of things. Jesus has done amazing stuff. Stuff that if you or I tried, we would probably fail miserably at. Jesus has been showing God's power. He has put God on display, and these people have witnessed it. They have just been a part of God taking this small meal and making it feed 5,000 people. They were there. They were the ones handing out the food and then going and picking up all the leftovers. They were a part of the miracle. And yet, these same guys that just witnessed God's power, as soon as they see something that they don't understand, that they don't expect, their first instinct, their first thought is to go, oh goodness, it's a ghost. Not, hey, God is doing more, God is continuing to work. Not, hey, that's Jesus. I've seen him do amazing things, he's probably just doing something else. They don't jump to God working, they jump to, oh, this is going to kill me. That's their first thought when they see Jesus coming. And yet there are several clues that Matthew writes into his gospel to make sure that they know, to make sure that they understand that God is just making his self known to them. If you take a look at all of the scripture, there's all kinds of miracles that God does with water, right? Just to name a few, like in 2 Kings with Elijah, the floating axe head, right? He touches the water, the axe head floats up. There are several times, the big one that we always think about is Moses parting the Red Sea, right? God causes there to be wind or whatever it is, and the sea parts, and the Israelites walk through on dry ground. Or there are a couple of times, like when he stops the Jordan River so that the Israelites can go across. He has done a lot of things with water and involved a lot of people in doing something with water. But the one thing that never happens with anyone else is walking on water. No one else in Scripture is allowed to step onto the water except God. There are, in fact, 3 times that are mentioned in the Old Testament. The first one is in Job chapter 9, verse 8. He says, he alone stretches out the heavens and treads on the waves of the sea. The second comes in Psalm 77, 19. He says, your path led through the sea. Your way through the mighty waters, through your footprints were never seen. And the last one comes in Isaiah chapter 43. Chapter 43, verse 16, it says, this is what the Lord says, he who made a way through the sea, a path through the waters. These are the only 3 times that anyone is allowed to walk on water aside from this, and they all refer to God. Now, I know that the disciples may not have been the brightest bulbs, but they still understood the scriptures. They still understood and knew the Old Testament. And so to see someone walking on the water should kind of ring a bell. It should spark some interest and know that if someone really is walking out to them on top of the water, maybe we should start with thinking about God rather than a ghost. And the second clue that Matthew gives us, people argue about whether he really meant this or not, but I don't know how he could not mean this. When Jesus sees them and they cry out and they're afraid, Jesus says what? He says, take courage, right? Verse 27. Jesus immediately said to them, take courage, it is I. Don't be afraid. Now, we've translated this as, it is I. But this is one of those spots. We only think of John doing this, but actually Matthew does this where he takes the words out of Exodus where God says, I am. And Jesus says, take courage, I am. Don't be afraid. The disciples are told, God is here on the water. Don't be afraid. So Matthew gives us these clues and tries to get the disciples to understand who they're dealing with, who they're messing with. It's not just a ghost. It's not just some guy. He is not just another good teacher. Jesus is God. He is God who is in control of the water, who is in control of the wind and the waves. He is the one who can cross on top of chaos. And they were supposed to recognize it. But it was difficult even for them to see that. And you take that and you translate it into today, and there are people who see this story and they call it a myth. They see Jesus walking on the water and they do everything they can to explain it away. They try to say that it never really happened. It wasn't actually something that took place. It was just a cool story. They call it a myth or a parable or all kinds of things. And they try to make sure that the power is taken away, that God is removed from the story. Because it doesn't make sense with the world. It doesn't make sense with what they know and understand or what they think they know and understand. And we see this all the time, right? We see it all over in our world. But you know what the thing was that really struck me as I started to study this? A lot of those people who were trying to explain it away were not non-Christians. As I studied this, there was a lot of people who were scholars, who are teachers of the gospel, who are leaders within our church, who would try to explain it away. They try to say, well, what happened was that because it was late and it was bad light and the disciples were tired, Jesus was really just coming out into the shallow water, and they thought he was on top of the water, but he really wasn't. And so, we don't need to have this weird, unearthly event. It was just a misunderstanding with the disciples. Or there are some who would even go back and look at the Greek and say, well, that Greek word doesn't really mean that he was walking on the water. It meant that he was like walking to the water. And so the disciples in the boat saw Jesus walking to the water, and then they took courage because they could see Jesus. They tried to explain away the miracle of Jesus walking on the water. Why? Why would people do that? Well, it's because when you look at something like a miracle, it's obviously unearthly. It's obviously supernatural. And when I say that, I mean it's just beyond the natural. It's not what we normally expect. And so to see something like that happen, we have to reason it out, right? Or at least that's the way we have become. We have to take that story, we have to take Jesus, and we have to make him fit inside our world. We have to make him fit inside what we think God should be and what we think the world should be and how it functions. And since I know these laws and I know that I really can't walk on water no matter how hard I try, no matter how salty it is, I still can't do it. And so if I can't do it, that means God can't do it. And so we explain it away. Now, I know that most of us are not going to try to explain away Jesus' miracle of walking on the water. I believe that most of you, if not all of you, really do believe that God would do this, can do this, that God is big enough. But is there a part in your life where you say, God, this is not yours? In this part, you don't get to be God, I do. There are parts in our lives where we are happily willing to trust God. We are happily willing to make him be big and bold and powerful. But then when it comes to the things that we don't want to give up, the little things that make us hide away. There are parts of our lives that maybe we don't want to share with others because we know that they wouldn't like them. Or we know that they may not be what God would like. And so we set limits and we say, God, you can fit into this part of my world, but not this. It's hard to let God be God. Like I said, these disciples, they knew Jesus could do this kind of stuff. They knew that he was powerful, and yet, when it didn't make sense at first, they didn't jump to God. They didn't make the conclusion that, hey, God is doing another miraculous thing. They just went to what fit in their world, or what was the thing that they knew and understood. Well, it must be a ghost. We've got to learn to let God be God. He is big enough. He is powerful enough. And we have to learn to make our world fit into God rather than trying to make God fit into our world. Because he's too big for it. He can't do it. Now, I know what you're maybe thinking. Wait, Jesus came into our world, right? And that's very true. Somehow God fit just himself into Jesus. But just because Jesus fit into here does not mean that I fully know who God is or I can tell him what to do. Just because he was kind enough to give me a glimpse of who he is, and without killing me and blowing my mind, he let me kind of see who he is, that does not give me the power to be like, God, let me tell you how to rule the world. I've got it down. Let God be God. Let him have control of your world rather than the other way around. The second thing that I want you to know, or that I tried to understand as I was getting ready for this, was that we need to learn to be prepared. Maybe like that Lion King song, be prepared. Okay. I want you to be prepared, like a good Boy Scout. I want you to know what you're getting into. See, as I was reading this, as I was taking a look, you know how you can read a passage and you can study it like 20, 30 times. You can spend all kinds of time going through it, doing comparisons, whatever you guys do in your Bible study. you take a look at it, you think you know it, and then suddenly, for some reason, whatever happened that day, or whatever is happening that year, or because somehow you accidentally got onto the King James Version when you thought you were reading the NIV or something, and suddenly one word just seems different to you. You read it, and you're going through going, yeah, I know this, and then all of a sudden something just pops out, and you're like, oh, wait. As I was reading this, one of those things happened. As I was going through, I was reading the story, and I'm going, yeah, the storm, the disciples are scared, Jesus is walking, it's amazing. The thing that stood out was, I don't know why I never really paid attention to this. Who else walks on water? Like, we always think it's just Jesus, right? But Peter actually makes it out on the water. And the thing that really got me about this was I always, for some reason, just kind of assumed that it was a Jesus thing. Like, Jesus is just like, Peter, let's do this. Get out of the boat. But when you stop and read it, Peter is the one that says, let me do it. God, I want to get out. The way he says it, he says, Lord, if it is you, right? Lord, if it is you, Peter replied, tell me to come out to you on the water. Now, again, one of those Greek things. In Greek, this is called I can't even do it right. It's a primary or a first proposition, meaning that it's kind of like an if-then statement, right? If this is true, then this should be true. But instead of it being an if-then statement, it's, I know this to be true. So, can I do this? And so Peter says to Jesus, Jesus, I know it is you. So since it's you, let me come out and play on the water too. And so Jesus says, all right, come on out. Let's do this. And so Peter steps out of the boat. Here's the thing. Again, all this context, I know I keep repeating it, but I want you to know it and understand it. Peter, being a professional fisherman, being a guy who has spent most of his life on the water to make a living, has spent close to 8 hours, if not 8 hours or more, rowing against the wind, fighting against the waves. He is tired. He is sleep deprived. He has seen Jesus do amazing, miraculous things already. And he has been a part of a huge miracle just a few hours earlier. And being beaten down and stuck in the middle of his life says, God, I want to do something bigger. I'm worn out. I'm tired. I've been doing what you told me to do for the longest time. And now, God, let me do something big. And so he steps out of the boat. And he starts walking to Jesus. He makes his way towards Jesus. But I'm not so sure he thought about what was going to happen when he asked Jesus to do something big. I'm not so sure that he thought through what was going to happen when he got out of the boat. Because as soon as the wind and the waves start to distract him, as soon as he feels the water under his feet and that it doesn't stay still and that it moves, he begins to sink. Peter is a lot like us, at least a lot like me. Maybe you guys are better than this. But we get going in life. We're doing what we're supposed to. We're working where God has put us. We're doing all the right things, but sometimes we get tired. Sometimes we feel like we're stuck or we're trapped. We feel like, God, if only you would do something big right now, we could get out of this place we're stuck in and we could do so much more. So God, would you use me to do something big and amazing? And then when God starts to do it, we get overwhelmed by it and realize we're not ready to do the thing God asked us to do, or we ask God to let us do. I almost wonder if Peter thought that if he stepped out of the boat, God would just make the water smooth. I wonder if he thought that as soon as he stepped out of the boat, the waves and the wind would stop and he'd be able to just walk to Jesus. But what I want you guys to understand today, the reason that we need to be prepared is that you don't just jump out of the boat and expect to walk on concrete. The hard part is what makes it miraculous. The hard parts, the difficulties, the changingness, the difficult part is what makes it miraculous. Because if it wasn't difficult, everybody could do it. If it wasn't difficult, anybody would be able to go out there. But if it's going to be a miracle, then it has to be beyond what we can do on our own. So if you want to jump out of the boat, and I think that's great, I encourage you, jump out of the boat. But be prepared, it's not going to get easy. If it were easy, everybody would do it. God is going to work through the difficulties. The next thing as I was reading through here, again, it kind of deals with the last part about being prepared, but it's its own thing when Peter gets out of the boat, right? And he's not prepared. What happens when he's not prepared? He loses his focus. What I want you guys to know is if you're going to jump out of the boat, don't lose your focus. I mean, Peter had done it. He got out of the boat. He was walking on water. Do you know how amazing that is? Like all of us, I would love to be able to do that. He actually did it. It wasn't just Jesus. He looked at Jesus. He said, "Can I do this?" And he stepped out and he walked on the water. He was there. Me being the person I am, I can only imagine at some point Peter getting with Paul, because they met several times in Jerusalem, right? And Peter being like, "Yeah, guess what I got to do?" And Paul being like, "Do you know how many times I was shipwrecked? Not once did Jesus make me walk on water. I had to swim." And Peter's like, "Ha ha. Jesus loves me more." Peter was actually doing it. He was out on the water walking. But again, when he lost his focus on Jesus, when he started to look away from Jesus, that's when he began to fall. You know, it made me think about actually walking on water. Actually, not even walking on water. I mean, we come up with ways of being able to do that. Have you seen those big, like they're foam, I think, mats that you can put out on the water, and that way, like, you can lounge around and float on top of the water? They're like huge area mats of foam. But we do all these things to try to say that we can walk on water. I've been on several boats in my life. Trying to walk on a boat that is on the water is hard enough. Especially when I feel like it's stormy and it's really not, but still. Trying to do anything that has moving parts to it. Last year, not just a couple of weeks ago, but last year for Olivia's birthday, we got to go ice skating out at the Running Y. And my kids had never been ice skating before. And to watch them try to learn how to ice skate was phenomenal. Especially when they stopped crying. But you get out there and you start to skate and you realize that it's not as solid as you thought it was, or it moves differently than you're used to. And eventually my kids all got it and they became great skaters. You're very good, Jeremiah. Good work. But it's hard because when you don't look out ahead, when you don't focus beyond your feet, you start to overcorrect. Like, even if you're rollerblading or roller skating or learning to do any of those things, I never actually broke any bones. Someone in my family decided he thought it was cool to break bones trying to roller skate or rollerblade. But if you have ever done any of those things, even learning how to drive a car, do you guys remember what it was like to learn how to drive a car? One of the hardest things for a lot of people to learn is not to look like right there in front of your hood, but to look down the road, right? Because if you look right here in front of your hood, you don't see the cars around you, and you start any bump in the road, any problem in the road, you start to overcorrect because all you see is this right here, and you start doing this. But as soon as you look up and you look down the road and you see what's ahead of you, you stop overcorrecting. A feel like that was what Peter's problem was, is that he had focused on Jesus. He had looked at where his focus should have been, and he was doing fine. But as soon as a problem happened, his eyes went from Jesus to his feet. And instead of seeing Jesus, and instead of seeing where he was going and knowing that he didn't have to overcorrect or undercorrect or do all these different things, all he had to do was just look up and see Jesus. But his focus was here instead of there. And so he began to sink. And that's what I find when we're learning how to do things like roller skating or driving. It's scary because when we have to look out there, you think that you're going to stop understanding yourself. You feel like you're not going to see what you're doing, or you lose yourself in it, right? When you look up and you put your focus way out there instead of on yourself, you feel like you're going to get lost in it. But the amazing miracle of it all is that when you do begin to look up and focus forward where you're supposed to, instead of losing yourself, you begin to feel where you belong in the rest of the world. When Peter looked at Jesus, he knew where he belonged and he could walk to Jesus, but as soon as his focus fell away from Jesus, he forgot where he belonged with Jesus. And so he began to fall, began to sink. We have to learn to put our focus not on ourselves, not to, when bad things start to happen, that instinct is to start to look to ourselves and to fix things. But in reality, our focus has to go up and stay up on Jesus, on God, because without that, we'll make even bigger mistakes and we'll fall beneath the water. The next thing, the third thing, the next point that I want you to get from this story, and I know I'm moving along. Sometimes, now this may seem odd, but sometimes it's okay to stay in the boat. Sometimes it's okay to stay in the boat. And the reason I say that is when you take a look at this, Peter's the only one that jumps out, right? He's the one that is gung-ho and says, I want to be doing something amazing and something great, and so I'm going to jump out of the boat and go meet Jesus. But there's a whole lot of other guys that are just sitting in the boat. Does Jesus get after them for that? Does Jesus say, hey, why weren't you out here? Does Jesus go, guys, come on, Peter shouldn't be the only one? You know what does happen? As soon as Jesus gets into the boat with them, the wind and the waves stop. As soon as Jesus gets to them in the boat, where he asked them to be, the wind and the waves stop. To me, that was amazing that, we always focus on Peter and he's so faithful or he's so impetuous or whatever it is. He jumps out and he goes to meet Jesus. But sometimes God has called us to a place. If you remember back at the beginning of the story, Jesus said, go, do it, be in the boat. And that's what they did. They were where God had called them to be. They were fighting the good fight that God had called them to fight against the wind and the waves. And none of them decided to jump out. Whether they were scared, whether they didn't want to do anything before somebody else did, who knows? But they stayed where God had called them to be, and Jesus walks across the water to meet them where he had called them to be. In the midst of their fight, Jesus meets them and makes the fight go away, or helps them fight it. Now, this isn't an excuse for all of you to be like, oh no, I'm just going to stay in the boat. I don't have to take any risks. It's okay. That's not what I'm getting at. What I want you to understand is that you don't have to feel like a failure if you don't jump out of the boat. You are not a failure if you don't step out like Peter did. Because sometimes you just need to say, God, I can't do this. I need you to meet me here. I don't know if that's exactly what the disciples were doing, but for me, that's something that I had to learn. I don't have to jump out and expect or try to make God do something miraculous and amazing. I can just sit in the place where God has called me to be and fight the fight he has called me to fight and wait for him to show up and make the wind and the waves stop. The last part of this, I'll close with this, is that if you take a look at the end of the story, the disciples show real growth. Because earlier in chapter 8, they had been in the boat. Jesus had been in the boat with them. And the wind and the waves are about to sink the boat. And they cry out and they say, Jesus, save us. And Jesus steps up and he says, shh, be quiet. The wind and the waves stop. And their response is, who is this? Who is this that can calm the wind and the waves with a word? And this time, when Jesus gets in the boat and the wind and the waves stop, what do? They say, you truly are the Son of God. And they fall down and worship. All of these things, everything that we've talked about this morning that has to do with walking on the water, putting God first, knowing what you're getting into, don't lose your focus. All of this comes down to the fact that if we are following Jesus and if we are trying to have any kind of growth, recognizing who God is can only have one ending: to fall down and worship. When you recognize who God is, when you put him as your focus and you let him be who he is and put your world into him rather than him into your world, amazing things become available. And the only response is to fall down and worship. Truly, you are the Son of God. And they worshiped him. That's what I would ask you guys to do. Just to fall on your faces, not to worry about what anyone else will say or what everyone else will think, but just to recognize that God, the one who can walk across chaos and tell it to be quiet, is the one who is coming to meet you and to make your world make sense. Let that make you worship who God is. Let's pray.